Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite and Liberal MP Jason Falinski. Good evening to both of you.
Hey, Sharri.
Matt,
Hey, Sharri.
Mike McGowan has tried to blame the latest hotel quarantine stuff-up in WA on the federal government. He says that Scott Morrison should be taking more responsibility for quarantine, that hotels were not designed to be, quarantine institutions. He's also said that he's going to reduce the caps on overseas visitors. Do you think this is Scott Morrison's fault?
Well, all the state premiers have been saying for some time now, Sharri, that there's a problem with hotel quarantine. We know that COVID-19 is one of the most contagious viruses around, and that it can be spread through airborne particles. And that implies that unless you have first-grade air conditioning systems, there's a risk of the spread of infection through hotel air conditioning systems. And that's what's been occurring, unfortunately, in various states. And the state premiers have been saying for some time now to the Commonwealth that we simply don't have the capacity in hotel quarantine to deal with the deadly nature of the infection and how contagious it is, and that the government should look at alternate quarantine arrangements, in particular perhaps utilising some of the detention facilities that are underutilised in Australia as an alternative to try and stop the risk of spread of infection through air conditioning systems and avoid a breakout in community transmission that's seeing cities have to be locked down and potentially jobs and the economy harmed.
Jason, why won't the federal government even look at this possibility of having a remote quarantine centre?
Because it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. The premiers know it doesn't work. Commonwealth knows it doesn't work.
How do we know? How do we know?
Because these things are operational. The air conditioning systems in detention centres are better than the ones in five-star hotels that are currently being used. And let's be clear, the only premiers saying this are Labor premiers, because they can't actually get their hotel quarantine systems to work. In New South Wales, which, by the way, the people of New South Wales are owed millions of dollars by Mark McGowan and the Western Australian government, they've managed to get this system to work. I mean, this dummy spit by Mark McGowan is of biblical proportions. Some of these premiers need to stand up and do their jobs and stop. They're always happy to take credit, but they never want to take responsibility. It's time to stand up and do his job.
I mean, Matt, that you'd have to admit that New South Wales has been able to manage the hotel quarantine system. When we've had an outbreak in New South Wales, the state has continued operating with only localised lockdowns that we saw in the Northern Beaches late last year. Very different to in WA, 1 case, 2 cases, 3 cases, and the entire city and wider region has to go into a lockdown.
Well, that's not the case, Sharri. The largest outbreak that's occurred in Australia occurred in New South Wales, and that was from the Ruby Princess, and the debacle that occurred predominantly through a mix-up with the Commonwealth and New South Wales Health. So I think that there's been these situations across all of the states. And Jason talked about taking responsibility. We know that quarantine under our Constitution is a Commonwealth responsibility. But this Commonwealth government, the Morrison government, seem to want to push those issues aside and just say, look, we'll either throw a bucket of money at it or we'll leave it up to the states. And that's not good enough in this scenario where we've got a highly contagious disease and quarantine is the domain of the Commonwealth. And the Australian public expect the Commonwealth government to look after them and to make sure that conditions are safe for Australians. After all, that's their number one goal, really, in a scenario like this.
Jason, do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely. I mean, let's knock this argument on the head once and for all. Every single state and territory signed up to them running the hotel quarantine system at a national cabinet in March. They did it again in June, and then we had the Victorian outbreak, which, by the way, was the most deadliest outbreak, not the Ruby Princess, as Matt tried to assert. And then, of course, then we had this Dan Andrews Twitter-inspired argument that somehow this is now the Commonwealth's job. It's now their job to look after. I mean, it is pathetic. We keep hearing this argument that everything good that's happened with the COVID-19 response is due to the Labor state premiers, and everything that's bad is due to Scott Morrison. The people of Australia know the truth. That Mark McGowan is running this hotel quarantine system. Daniel Andrews was running the hotel quarantine system when the whole thing went to hell in a basket. The Western Australian government owe the people of New South Wales millions of dollars because so many people from Western Australia have come back to Australia through
and not
New
just
South
WA,
Wales.
but Queensland as well. And we know the minister there tore up that cheque that Gladys Berejiklian
just
sent.
before he had a holiday in New South Wales.
Exactly, just before he went to Byron Bay. Because
this is the most dangerous place in the world, but it's good, not dangerous enough.
I tell you what, if you lived in Queensland, I don't know why you'd be coming to Byron for a holiday because there's too many influences there and the weather's better in Queensland. Now, Anthony Albanese is travelling to Uluru next week with Linda Burney to push for constitutional recognition of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Matt, wouldn't it be a bigger failure if this failed at a referendum?
Well, I don't believe it would fail at a referendum, Sharri. I think that the Australian people are ready for a serious debate about enshrining in our constitution a voice to Parliament. And the key ingredient to a successful referendum in Australia is bipartisanship. Only 8 of the 44 that have been held on constitutional variation have been successful. And the number one ingredient, the number one key to the success of those referenda has been bipartisanship. It's occurred in all 8 of them. Now, Labor is saying we will support and we will campaign with the government for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. And that is what the First Australians want. When are we going to listen to and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and listen to what they want? And they're saying quite clearly, they've been saying for some years now, ever since Uluru's Statement from the Heart was put together, that we want it enshrined in our constitution to give it meaning and to give it purpose. And I think it's time that we listen to them. The only thing standing in the way of bipartisanship is the Morrison government.
Well, Jason, are there some Liberal MPs who disagree with the Prime Minister's decision not to enshrine an Indigenous voice in Parliament?
Well, no, I don't think there are, to be honest. And look, I want to say that I agree with Matt, that if we are going to ensure the future of this nation, we need to reconcile our present with our past. Part of that was the voice of the voice of Uluru, and that's a pretty critical thing that we're going through at the moment. It is fair to say, however, that Indigenous Australians didn't speak with one voice and didn't come up with a common proposal for the government to reject or not to reject. So those discussions need to go forward. I think it's a great thing that Linda and Anthony Albanese are out in Uluru this week, talking to Indigenous Australians, seeing if we can get some sort of common view or some common elements that we can put to the Australian people.
Okay. Now, there's a report in the Herald today in the Fairfax Press that Australians are using a backdoor to escape the travel ban, that they're flying to New Zealand and then using the New Zealand base to travel overseas. Matt, this is very concerning.
It certainly is, Sharri. The government put in place measures to protect Australians during this difficult period of COVID, and they were supported by the opposition. And those health measures that were put in place basically restricted overseas travel for good reason, to try and stop the risk of infection and to keep the Australian public safe. However, they put in place measures for exemptions on compassionate grounds, and all of us as MPs have been assisting members of our constituency who've had to travel overseas to attend a relative's funeral, maybe to attend the birth of a child or for serious surgery. There are exemptions that exist, but they are only on compassionate grounds. So if anyone is trying to flaunt the system through the back door by going to New Zealand for a holiday or going for non-compassionate grounds, I think that they're doing the wrong thing, and they should expect to be prosecuted because they're ultimately risking the safety of the rest of the Australian population by potentially going to a hotspot and bringing COVID back into our society. And one of the relative successes of Australia during COVID has been the fact that the Australian people have been willing to chip in and do their bit. And anyone that's trying to go through the back door, I would argue, is not doing their bit.
Jason, just quickly, should the people who are doing this face full level of fines or other criminal punishment, or are they just exercising their civil liberties, and if they want to travel overseas for a meeting or some other reason, they should be able to do that?
Well, In short, yes, they should face some very strict fines if they do this. The fact is, what Matt said is right. They are putting all Australians in danger by doing it. We didn't do this for fun. As a civil libertarian, I have immense problems with us not allowing people to travel overseas when and as they need to, but they have been done for good reasons. With the rollout of the vaccine, hopefully those reasons will be able to be rolled back very shortly.
All right. Jason Falinski and Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you both very much for your time. Really enjoyed that discussion.
Thanks, Sharri.
Thanks, Sharri.
Coming up.